I'd like to introduce Monica Agari Magami, who's going to host today's webinar. During COP28, she participated remotely for 2 weeks and provided a comprehensive report, which is available on the IEF website. She is an international regulatory lawyer. Her fields of expertise include climate change and artificial intelligence. For the last 15 years, she's been working as a lawyer in London in major global consulting and tech organizations, and she's a qualified lawyer in Brazil and the European Union. And her COP28 report is available at ief.world/climate-COP28. So now I'd like to hand over the webinar to Monica.
Thank you very much. Also thanking everyone for joining us today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to an interactive discussion on a topic that affects all of us. And while the panelists and so many others in this call are influencing the discourse that humanity is facing, I'm confident that we will gain some insights and come away with ideas that will help us make changes on a local, national, and international levels. And surely the direction of the narrative that humanity is writing together will be influenced by this type of discussions that we're having here, such as the one that we're having today. We're very fortunate to have not just one, but 4 experts in climate change that are going to be giving their presentations and sharing their insights on their experiences, also with COP28. So I would like to introduce the first speaker, and that is Halldór Thorgeirsson. And he will speak today about how did governments take stock of overall progress under the Paris Agreement. Just giving a short introduction about Halldór. He served as Senior Director at the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, UNFCCC, and he currently chairs the Icelandic Climate Council. He advised the UAE presidency in its final preparations and during COP28. So I would like to invite Halldór very kindly to take over from now. And later on I can present the other panelists. Thank you, Halldór.
Thank you very much, Monica. And it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to contribute to this this webinar, and I will limit my reflections on COP28 to the formal intergovernmental process. Other important dimensions will be addressed by subsequent speakers. But let me just observe that the scale of these annual conferences of the parties to the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement has become unmanageable. Around 70,000 participants traveled to Dubai to participate in COP28 and associated events, just to give you a sense of the scale. However, the number of government negotiators has been rather stable, and private sector climate action has grown year by year, and the exchange at the multitude of side events and parallel events at COPs has become much more focused and action-oriented. This is very positive and enhances international cooperation in very many of the solution areas that we're seeking. The presidency, the UAE presidency, also organized a series of thematic days, including the first on public health and climate change. And the fact that 154 heads of state and government and 22 international leaders accepted the invitation of UAE to participate in the Global Climate Action Summit on the first days of COP28 exceeded expectations, given the geopolitical situation we are facing. So turning to what the intergovernmental process was faced with, and turning to the global stocktake, This COP, in a sense, was a first test of the ambition mechanism of the Paris Agreement, sometimes referred to as the ratcheting up mechanism, because it was to conclude the first global stocktake, which is taking stock of aggregate progress, not individual countries. And the Paris Agreement runs on an internal rhythm and has a clock of 5 years. And every 5 years, the COP takes stock of overall progress towards the ultimate goal of limiting the disruption of climate to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So this is the first time we basically concluded one cycle. And then the next step after this global stocktake, which is quite important, is for parties to the Paris Agreement to assess at home what they can achieve domestically and come forward with, and this is one of the terms in the agreement, nationally determined contributions, and often referred to as NDCs. These are the contributions that countries decide that they can bring to the objective, and this has to be done before COP30, 2 years from now, which will be hosted by Brazil. Turning to the global stocktake then, and I might use the acronym GST or the global stocktake. It's important to underline that this is a fact and science-based process. And the technical phase of the global stocktake concluded just before COP28 in Dubai with a synthesis report of the co-facilitators of the technical phase. And for those of you that wish to get a better sense of the substance here, I would encourage you to scan that document and to it's quite readable actually. And this is the synthesis report of the co-facilitators of the technical phase. And this technical phase was in turn resting on or based on the 6th assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And that was, as you know, was concluded in March of 2023. But before turning to the headline outcomes and what they concluded, parties concluded on this, I wanted to, as a way of context, recall the realities of 3D building. This is an organic process. The Paris Agreement is a living instrument. Yes, it was negotiated in 2015 and entered into force in record time, less than a year later in 2016. And the negotiations of what was termed the rule book or the implementing guidelines for it were concluded at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 during the COVID pandemic. And this agreement, like other treaties, continues to evolve through implementation at the national level, through decisions by COPs, and through work of formal bodies constituted under the agreement. So it's important to keep this in mind, because it will be important in terms of what I will be saying in a few moments. And the basic paradigm of the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement focuses on emissions and removals of greenhouse gases. In a sense, it takes an atmospheric perspective, looks at everything from what actually enters the atmosphere for good reasons. However, the sources of these emissions are considered to fall within national sovereignty. You are responsible for the emissions of your economic activity, but the agreement doesn't prescribe what kind of economy you develop. This paradigm shifted in Dubai at COP28 with the outcome on the global stocktake and its explicit language on the sources of energy. That paradigm shift had started in Glasgow 2 years ago with the case of coal. And allowing this to happen was a major concession for oil exporting nations, in particular the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They came to COP28 with the position of not going beyond language that had been agreed a few months earlier by G20 at their summit in India. And the most contested paragraph of the outcome of the global stocktake, which is actually 196 paragraphs, the agreed outcome, was paragraph 28. And you will have heard about some aspects of it in news coverage, but it's worthwhile to take a moment to look at the full picture of what was agreed in that paragraph, because it was a broader narrative. And so I will now quote directly from that outcome, just to give you a sense of the fuller picture. So the COP calls on parties to contribute to the following global effort in a nationally determined manner. Number one, to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030, to double global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements by the same date. Third, to accelerate efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power. Number four, accelerating efforts globally towards net zero emission energy systems, utilizing zero and low carbon fuels well before or by around mid-century. And then number five, which was most reported, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. Number six, accelerating zero and low emission technologies, including inter alia renewables, nuclear, abatement and removal technologies, such as carbon capture and utilization and storage, particularly in hard to abate sectors and low carbon hydrogen production. And then it continues with other things dealing with non-carbon dioxide emissions, particularly methane, accelerating reduction of emissions from road transport, and phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. The reason why I wanted to list these 9 actions is that is what put the language on fossil fuel into context. And you will notice that the notion of phase down of unabated coal power is in this agreed outcome, and this is language used in Glasgow 2 years ago. And now I wanted to observe something, and this is my personal assessment here. The notion of phase out or phase down has been very controversial in the climate debate and has been opposed by India and China and other developing countries. This is understandable in my view. Phase out makes good sense, that term, phasing out, makes good sense in the Montreal Protocol on ocean depleting substances, which uses phase out schedules. But the ocean depleting substances are manufactured chemical substances, and they have been substituted by others. Transforming the energy system is a different undertaking. It was therefore necessary to develop a broader, more comprehensive narrative and combine the transition away from fossil fuels with the scaling up of renewable energy and accelerating energy efficiency improvements. So this was very significant in my view. It's too early now at this juncture to determine what the impact will be. For that, we need to wait for the next round of NDCs, as I mentioned. But it's clear, however, is that this outcome was as good as one could hope for, given the geopolitical situation and the tension between developed and developing countries. And also, just to conclude, also to recall that the decision adopted at the opening of the COP to establish a fund for loss and damage resulting from the impacts of climate change was hugely important, and this will benefit the most vulnerable. So these are my observations. I just want to observe, as it was mentioned, that I had assisted UAE, and I just wanted to say that it was a great honor to work with them in this huge undertaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Halldór. Well, I'm now going to introduce the next speaker, and that will be Rosie Poirier.
Do we want to give time to the audience to ask questions to Halldór? We have one from Pascal that says, given the big oil involvement in this COP, do you feel like it's still useful to participate? I think you outlined the benefits that came out of it.
Well, yeah, this was very much part of the debate leading up to the COP, and what is needed is a major transformation of energy systems, and you can't do that without the practitioners. You can't do it without the countries that are now heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And this is why it was very significant that in oil exporting country that this decision was adopted. And I'm not so sure it would have been possible to achieve this outcome anywhere else.
Thank you, Halldór. So the next speaker that I'm going to call is Rosie Poirier. She will be speaking about communications and cross-sector collaboration at COP28. Rosie Poirier. Hi, Rosie. She is a marine scientist, underwater photographer, and an artist. She works primarily in the field of sustainable resource management and conservation, and she focuses on accelerating programs of action in the sustainability sector. So Rosie, now with you.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here and to be with all of you. It's really great to see so many faces who are engaged in this conversation across the world. So I don't have the policy background that Halldór, Sylvia, or some of the others have, because my background has been more focused in marine science and conservation management on a more like localized regional level, and then also in communications and the arts. So that's something that I can speak to a little bit more of, like the work on the ground in terms of how to leverage communications when we're trying to create large cultural shifts. But I'll just start it off with some of the reflections. We're asked to prepare some reflections on the international, national, and local scale. And Halldór did a very great job of going over the outcomes of COP, which I also agree although there are a lot of criticisms of a fossil fuel nation hosting COP, there's also a lot of scrutiny that is often given in bias, because coming from Canada, I'm based in Canada. Canada hosted COP15, the biodiversity COP, last year, and Canada is one of the large fossil fuel nations of the world as well. And we have the tar sands, which are some of the most carbon intensive forms of extracting fossil fuels, but Canada is not given the same scrutiny. So sometimes there is also a bias in terms of how we talk about different nations. And there is also a benefit in having a fossil fuel nation host and speak to other fossil fuel nations, and to be able to leverage that and to galvanize action and to get them on board. So there were some really encouraging outcomes. And then also, of course, there's always setbacks as well. So the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund and the acceleration of that from the first day of COP, agreements on mitigation measures for achieving net zero emissions, and the launch of the 30 billion private market climate capital, having 118 countries sign the Renewable Energy Pledge to triple world's green energy capacity by 2030. These are some really fantastic outcomes, but then there are always some challenges as well. There were more oil lobbyists present at this COP than any previous COP, and there was an analysis that was put out about the corporate attendees that showed that 9 in 10 large businesses, this is not all businesses, but 9 out of the 10 large businesses attending COP were either lobbying against progressive climate-related policy shifts or not engaging with green policy and some of the green policy goals. But on the national level, there were also some really great, there was a lot of great progress that was seen. And one of these I find particularly interesting because I focus on, I do some work in food security related to the ocean sector, which is what I'll be talking about in my presentation next month, but was the focus on agriculture during this COP and the inclusion of agriculture and in the national adaptation plans. And this is something that is taking more of a forefront in the conversation, and is also something that is reflected in the Baha'i teachings, where we are told that the fundamental basis of a community is agriculture, and that all people should be producers and focusing on production and feeding, and it doesn't have to be directly, but this is in the writing. So it's really great as well to see this reflected at COP, to see this focus on food security and agriculture and the contribution of agriculture to biodiversity targets, to couple some of the biodiversity targets. So I was really encouraged to see that, but where I was the most encouraged and where I was working the most closely was more on the grassroots scale. So it was very encouraging because I wasn't engaged in the negotiations themselves. I was working more in the side events. The company that I work with, we hosted a 2-day side event in the Green Zone. And I was really encouraged to see grassroots local solutions that were taking charge, and that this COP had a much broader and more inclusive platform for showcasing local initiatives than the COP that I had attended previously the year before. The Green Zone was very well established. There were a lot of people engaging in the Green Zone that were not necessarily engaged in like the broader climate conversation. Like you were seeing a lot of tourist school groups and people who were having the opportunity to come to the Green Zone to experience some of the conversation, to experience some of the side events, whereas the previous COP didn't quite have that local and broader engagement. And it was also, this was one of the most inclusive COPs as well in terms of Indigenous involvement, youth engagement. But in terms of some of the long-term targets, what I saw is a failure or a point for improvement is there's an inadequate availability of grants and mentorship to scale and accelerate projects of impact. So some of these grassroots projects face a lot of hurdles, a lot of red tape to be able to scale or to garner support or to garner funds and resources to be able to represent the scale of impact that we need around the world and the scale of action that we need around the world. But the solutions are there, and people are innovating, and they're developing some really fantastic solutions that are localized and culturally relevant as well, because you can't just take a cookie cutter solution and apply it all over the world. You have to look at a region, at a local community, and assess the challenges that they're uniquely facing within the realm of broader climate action. But this is the realm where the entertainment and culture world and the arts world really plays a huge role. So we were working closely with the Entertainment Culture for Climate Action, which is an initiative to unite cultural sector and share climate goals and solutions. And it was conceived by the president of the UN General Assembly a few years ago to engage and to bring to the forefront the importance of the arts and communication within climate action. And this year was the first ever entertainment and culture pavilion that was hosted at COP, and they had 158 different presentations that span across a diversity of sectors. And these are some of the assessments that have come out of ECCA, which is the Entertainment Culture for Climate Action. So there are more than 50 million people working in the entertainment and culture sector, and the IPCC has estimated that in order to establish new social norms, this requires the committed engagement of approximately 10 to 30% of social influencers and thought leaders. And engaging communications in that way is recognizing that a lot of the challenges that we face in terms of climate action are based on the values that are being promoted. And in order to make the changes that we need at scale, we need a shift in our values. And it was really encouraging to see the BIC there and having conversations about these value-based approaches. It was really encouraging to see people on the ground having these discussions about how do we create these shifts, and really encouraging to see the way that storytelling, and in all of its forms, not necessarily just through film, but also through art, and through writing, through engagement, how storytelling in all of its forms as the most ancient and most effective form of communication is creating a shift in terms of our values and the way that we are tackling climate action. So communication can be this really effective tool for positive change, or it can also stall action within the world, depending on how it's been applied. So there have been huge media campaigns from like oil lobbyists, the oil industry, to almost like elicit a lack of action. But we also need an even greater push for action, a greater push for inclusion, a greater push for empowering communities, and to really engage our culture and our communities in terms of communication and education in order to create these large cultural shift that is needed in climate action. So this is the area that I've really been focusing on. And there's always the conversation of does culture influence art, or is art influencing culture? And it really does go both ways. And so through the arts and through communication, we can start to create these cultural shifts, because at the end of the day, we can't continue with business as usual. And that's not just from an economic standpoint, that's also from a values standpoint. So shifting our baseline of values and valuing justice, valuing equity, valuing access to opportunity, and better state of well-being, valuing happiness for people. These are things that need to be pushed in terms of climate action, because climate action isn't just about reducing carbon, it's also about building more equitable systems and systems that can be sustained for the future. So those are some of my reflections in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Rosie. I think that is such a valid point to raise about the values-based approach and also creating this positive change in the way it is applied. So I will now introduce the next speaker of tonight. Actually tonight for some people, morning for others, and afternoon for others. But next one is Arthur Dahl. We will have him speaking about bringing values into COP28, Bahá'í International Community. So just giving a short introduction about Arthur. He's the president of the International Environmental Forum and a retired senior official of UNEP. He collaborates frequently with the Bahá'í International Community and has participated in previous COPs. He has an ocean of knowledge of climate change as well. Arthur, let me pass it over to you.
Thank you. Let me start sharing my screen if I can get this to work properly. I hope you can all see that. But I was trying, there are three parts to my short presentation. The first is really the Baha'i perspective, what the Baha'i community was doing there very briefly, what it was trying to achieve. The second is what the president of the COP said they had achieved. And then the last part was about a wonderful Baha'i from South Africa, who was in fact the official photographer Secretary General. So she was really right in the middle of everything the whole time, taking pictures and following it. And her own reflections on Facebook immediately afterwards really captured, much the balance of positive and negative, so to speak, as a way of sort of capturing what was the experience of this COP. And of course, we know this was, the formal meeting of the Climate Change Convention. It was held in this amazing conference center in Dubai. And of course, 70,000 to 80,000 participants with over 40 Baha'is, several IF members, trying to bring a values perspective to the public discourse on climate change. This was the group of Baha'is there the first week. I don't have a picture for the second week, but you can already see from a variety of different parts taking part in bringing these values into the COP. And so the Baha'i community with others was promoting a values roadshow to explore humanity's shared values and the coherent principles to be collectively embraced to advance climate justice. They looked at a number of questions in these different elements of the roadshow as they moved around in the many events taking place. What values must underlie initiatives and advancement on each issue? What values currently underlie work on the issue, consciously and subconsciously, because many of our values are subconscious? Where do we see misalignment between the two previous questions, and how can we overcome it? And are there examples where we see an evolution of thinking at the level of values on the issue? This is what Rosie was just sharing with us, was the need to really change our values with respect to these issues. The roadshow explored values through the lens of diversity of intersecting themes and constituencies. So they partnered with many different groups on climate-induced migration, on resilience, on disaster risk reduction, on faith, food systems, gender equality, indigenous issues, small island developing states, and youth. So they really were moving around, bringing values into a variety of different things. This is the Baha'i community's delegation there at the COP. An amazing group of people from New York and from around the world. Dan Perel, who was the lead Baha'i community representative on this issue, to the Baha'i community, the company was trying to be more future-oriented, beyond the immediate challenges. He has a primary role to turn to conversations at the UN and internationally, and it draws on the learning of Baha'i communities at the grassroots. The Baha'i writings ask us to be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age in which we live. They should be locally driven, whether issues biodiversity, gender, race, climate change, or whatever. So it's this balance of global and local that the Baha'i community can bring into it. Youth, of course, are really attached to reading the local realities, identifying their needs. He referred to this wonderful video from the youth Fontana in Vanuatu, who saw that fish stocks were being depleted and started an intergenerational discussion with the chiefs and with the community of returning to traditional ways, limiting overfishing. It worked so well, it's now being copied all across the island, the amazing Baha'i communities in Tana, where they have a Baha'i house of worship now. This is an opportunity to demonstrate that the faith can be a learning community, not rigid and outdated, producing more sustainable results. The faith declaration, there were two. The one was approved before the COP28, and then there was a call to action at the COP28 itself. It was only the first step. Dan said the next step should be interfaith community learning to work together with the scientists, with the youth, indigenous peoples, with women, consolidating what has been achieved and reaching out to others. So really the challenge going ahead is to build these networks going forward. He said it's hard to measure changes in heart, in values that make things happen, what Rosie's already referred to. What makes people accept short-term sacrifices for a long-term goal? We're clearly not moving fast enough. We need stronger motivation. He said market forces of others are not sufficient. The economy discounts the future as compared to the present, so the wrong values there in the economy. The future is worthless in our economic model, yet parents will sacrifice everything for their children. So we said we need to replace the whole system, go forward. So this is more than just climate change, it's the whole economic system that's driving us in the wrong direction. Dan said we just plan for a just transition, not only words on a page. It's complicated when the issue is us versus them. So we need real solutions. The one tool used, of course, in Baha'i communities is consultation. Everybody together, not adversarial and criticizing, but looking for positive solutions, co-creating a better future. The process is inclusive and open, suited to the needs of the community. Dan is the one on the left in this group of the Baha'i community representatives, an amazing young person. The Faith Pavilion there, the first time there's been a Faith Pavilion at a COP, had 65 sessions with 300 speakers from every corner of the world. 120 faith organizations took part. This is one of the photos in the Faith Pavilion. There was an interfaith call to action that extended an expression of hope rooted in reality. It called attention to the extreme urgency of this moment. Climate science community has pointed out how quickly others have reached tipping points. Ambitious actions is needed at COP28 to hold to the ceiling 1.5 degrees and protect the life today and in the future. And therefore, the climate action called for adding our energy, our prayers, our actions to the voices of all the different sectors to call together for ambitious advocacy, action, and agreement on climate change at COP28 and beyond. In fact, right now, I'm chairing a group for the G20 Interfaith Forum, planning a whole climate track for the G20 meeting in Brazil, later on this year to try to bring climate issue and faith together in this process. There's a beautiful video that Sylvia made. She'll be talking next, but you can get the link. It's available. You can see it from the website if you want to follow it. There's Sylvia at COP28. And of course, COP20 was a crucial meeting for action on climate change, as the UN warns that a radical transformation is now required. Countries that are far apart, with the most vulnerable and those looking at science, wanting a strong decision, wanting a rapid phase of fossil fuels, while the opposition countries refused any mention. The OPEC countries, there was a memo saying we want to block any mention of fossil fuels. This is a view of the plenary. You can see what the meeting was like. Another view of the COP plenary. Pictures taken by Carrie Worth. On the last day, the negotiations went overnight we went into overtime in some of the negotiations. And it was only 11:15 on the 13th of December that there was thunderous applause through the halls of COP20 as the parties to the Paris Agreement formally adopted the decision text in the first ever global stocktake with no objections. The following is part of what the COP president said in his closing remarks. There's the COP president. We have delivered a comprehensive response to the global stocktake. We've delivered a robust action plan to keep 1.5 degrees in reach. It's a balanced plan that addresses emissions. It's built on common ground. It's strengthened by full inclusivity. It's a historic package to accelerate climate action. Many said this could not be done. When I spoke to you at the very start, I promised a different sort of COP, private and public sectors. Everyone came together from day one. Everyone united, acted and delivered. We operationalized loss and damage and filled the fund. We delivered world first after world first. It's built on common ground. It's strengthened by full inclusivity. It's enhanced, balanced, and make no mistake, historic package. For the first time, deliver on methane and on emissions. We have language on fossil fuels and for the first time ever. Let me sound a word of caution. Any agreement is only good as the implementation. We are what we do, not what we say. We must turn this agreement into tangible action. If we unite, we can have a profound effect on all our futures. Inclusivity kept us going in difficult days. Everyone has been heard, from the indigenous people to youth to global south. We've reframed the conversation around the climate finance. We've integrated the real economy into the climate challenge. So that was the positive view of Sultan Abu Jaber. Here is again, thumbs up at the end of the COP. And then Kiara Worth's reflections as the official photographer, Secretary General. He said, I don't know how, but we survived COP28. After consultation all night, the revised text, the Global Stocktake, came out early this morning. While it didn't bring a clear call to phase out fossil fuels, it did set in motion the transition away from them, and indeed, this is a big step. There was applause the decision was made, and immediately news headlines hailed this as a historic achievement. This is the applause. That's John Kerry from the US on the left. But as the COP president said in closing remarks, the world needed to find a new way. By following our North Star, we have found that path. But not everyone agrees. There was a demonstration, of course, outside at COP28. Samoa, representing the small islands most vulnerable to climate change, said this was not ambitious enough. We've concluded that the course correction needed has not yet been secured. This was met by an uproar of applause, particularly from civil society and developing countries. There's the Samoan delegate saying this was not ambitious enough. The delegate from the Marshall Islands burst into tears, realizing the fate of her people had been sealed. And I burst into tears too, Kiara said. Of course, the Marshall Islands will go underwater because they're not going to be changing fast enough. The delegate from the Marshall Islands in tears, seeing the end of her country coming because not enough is being done fast enough. Kiara said, I've been crying ever since. I don't know how I made it through that closing plenary. I was overwhelmed with emotion, thinking about the small islands, and Palestine. The self-congratulatory remarks about what a success this has been. I will take note of people suffering. And the North Star, I don't get to see because like most people, I'm from the global South. Shame, the youth delegates screamed in the microphone. Shame, screamed the youth delegates. I felt like they were shouting to me. Have I done enough? Can I hold myself to account the way I expect others to? What has been my contribution been? And why haven't I done it better? Why haven't we all done better? What can it take for us to recognize our common humanity? I know a lot of this is sheer exhaustion, the sudden depletion of direction, forgiving so much of myself after these weeks, but there's an underlying truth to it too. Yes, there were positive outcomes, and yes, we're in a better pathway, but it's not enough. My virtue for today was acceptance. I don't think I've done well with that. The only thing I can think of are the words of Secretary General, I promise I won't give up. That's what Chiara said, the Secretary General said as well. So that gives her a balanced view of what came out of COP28 on the positive and on the not nearly enough side. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for bringing the values-based aspect and also your thoughtful views of what really happened at COP28 in a very human and with a spiritual-based dimension. I would also like now to introduce Sylvia Carlson Vinquisen. She will be speaking about making the COP28 outcome meaningful at home in our countries and communities. Some reflections. So Sylvia is another expert. She is an associate professor in public administration and policy at Wageningen University, and she's involved in a research project on the role of the global stocktake in the Paris Agreement. She is one of the founding members of the IEF, the International Environmental Forum. Sylvia, let me pass it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to share a few reflections from my side of this, and let me just, it was my my role to be at the COP as a researcher, and following the global stocktake, and particularly in our research project, we're also looking at what's going to come after that. But these comments that I will make now are more my personal reflections from my own value standpoint on what we all can do. And I think you will see that in the beginning, there will be a little bit of overlap with what Halldór was sharing, because I want to really start where he started to explain the core design of the Paris Agreement, in the sense that it really lays out, as most international treaties, that the core responsibility of addressing climate change is really with states, with national governments. And under the Paris Agreement, states have legal obligations, and these are mostly procedural. They are obliged, they have to send in their plans, what Halldór referred to, the nationally determined contributions about what they will do to address climate change. And they then later have to send in reports on what they actually have done. However, on the more substantive side, it is states who decide both what they want to do and how much they want to do in terms of addressing climate change. So that is really the starting point for not only the Paris Agreement, but many international laws on the environment. So there is this obligation in the Paris Agreement in Article 14.3 that also Halldór mentioned, where it states that the outcome of the global stocktake shall inform parties, meaning the countries who have signed the Paris Agreement, in updating and enhancing in a nationally determined manner their actions and support in accordance with the relevant provisions of this agreement, as well as in enhancing international cooperation for climate action. So this really means that the outcome of this stocktake needs to be taken up at home in countries, as we heard earlier. Then, when we know in a bit less than 2 years what countries have done in terms of revising their national climate plans, and we can see, have they now really done what they are supposed to do to increase ambition, to develop much higher ambition for their climate action, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation to climate change, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, but also in terms of supporting financially other countries who need that. When we see there, which is a very plausible situation, that countries have not upscaled their actions sufficiently to stay within 1.5 degrees, that is one possibility. We do not have possibilities within the formal COP process under the Paris Agreement itself. There are not much possibility to hold states to account for failing to do so sufficiently. And we cannot send countries to jail. There is no court that will judge if they have not upgraded their NDCs enough. And I think this is really important for us to bring home, and for the world to understand. It doesn't mean that this is the ideal state of international law that we need. Maybe we should have another more ambitious type of international law, but this is where we are now. And what that really means is that what remains is a form of self-accountability, both in terms of states, of our national governments, countries around those governments. What is left is for them to hold themselves to account for what they have signed on to in this agreement. It is them, it is the countries that have to think and reflect on the outcome of the stocktake, and then what I hope in ideally in a dialogue with their societies, see how they could take the most possible highest ambition in the future years on what they can do differently in order precisely to prevent the most vulnerable states, for example, from disappearing and much other suffering. But we can also take that for ourselves, that it is us who have to, as individuals, as neighborhoods and communities, we have to look ourselves in the mirror at the backdrop of the outcome of this stocktake and see what we can do. Because with climate change, it is not something that you can address by simply changing a few policies, which is that governments easily can do. For example, like was possible with the Montreal Protocol, that you can substitute a few chemicals, you can stimulate certain businesses to do that, you can forbid certain things. Climate change is about addressing everything that we do in society. It's about how we produce energy, how we heat our houses, how we produce our food, how we travel to our loved ones, etc. So it is really a whole community, a whole world community that has to take a deep reflection on what it does and see how that can change. And every action counts. One of the lines also in the outcome of stocktake, based on the science and the IPCC report, clearly shows that it is action, the sooner the better. It should have been yesterday, but it is really action in the next few years, in this decade, that is the most urgent if we're going to have a chance to stay as closely as possible to 1.5 degrees. So we cannot wait for governments to make plans for what's going to happen between the year 2031 and 2035, which is the next NDC's timeline. But we have to, all of us, think what we can do now, and that every reduction in emissions count. And never think that any action is too small. So just to summarize that story is that we cannot wait for, one country or one government or only the governments to lead. We all need to lead this process together. And so what I think that we can do as individuals and in our communities is to do these 4 things. We can really take the time to study the outcome of this process, and that we can study the political outcome of the global stocktake. We can also study what Halldór already referred to as the final technical report that was maybe more broadly and representatively reflecting all the rich scientific input that came to the global stocktake before the political negotiation started, and that's the synthesis report of the global stocktake. To study that, however technical languages is, there will also, I'm sure, will be coming out easier to read, more accessible summaries of these. But then, as a next step, reflect on what that means for where we are as individuals in our neighborhoods and our communities, and even our countries, because we can also engage in the discourse in our countries around what this outcome means for what we should change. But we can certainly do what it means for ourselves, for our family, and where we are active in our daily life. And then we can consult with those around us and identify what things we can change together. And of course, finally, not stay by consultation, but then take action and continue this circle, because this process will have to be enduring, we'll have to continue doing this on a continuous basis for decades and decades to come, both in terms of minimizing our emissions, but also in terms of adapting to climate change. So it is something that we will need to do and help our children learn to do, and to integrate that in our normal conversations about how to beautify and strengthen our communities where we live. So some of the examples, if you start studying these documents, that we can then reflect on, you have already heard a couple of them from previous speakers, but here's a few. So the urgent need to address the mitigation gap, both in terms of what we aim for, how much ambition we should have, but also that we also then actually turn that ambition with the best policies that actually achieve that ambition. And the other point that I also alluded to, that global emissions have to be reduced rather sooner than later, where the science says that it should really globally peak latest 2025 to be in line with 1.5 degrees. And this is also captured very much in the next point, this need for deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So this is something we just have to keep reducing over a long time, that we need to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems, and to take a very personal reflection on that. What does that mean in where I live, where I drive, how I communicate, etc. And another of the, of course, many pages of conclusions in this document is also the importance of conserving, protecting, and restoring nature, an ecosystem, and halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation. So there are many opportunities, and as well also in terms of how you work the land and in systems of agriculture, So all of these things are just, you know, small samples of that we can reflect on. If you look at the outcomes of the, first say, of the political outcome, and you do a word search, you hardly find anything on values. You hardly find anything on, I don't think you found anything on education. But if you go back to the synthesis report of the technical phase, that's very similar, but you do find something more interesting there that is not, or barely not, in the political outcome document. There's a little bit referring to adaptation and transformative adaptation. But in the synthesis document of the global stocktake, you have this already the second key finding refers to that there's a need to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. Governments need to support systems transformations that mainstream climate resilience and low GHG emissions development. So that is it's an entry point, I think, when we have conversations with those around us. What does systems transformation mean on an individual, local, neighborhood, and societal level? And I think that can really provide a lot of rich conversations and deep reflections for going forward. And I just want to end with this picture I took at the COP. I thought, you know, it was such a amazing diversity of people from all over the world attending this COP, and they're all going home. And then there was this text in the background, "Let's be bold." And I hope that we all, both those of us who were there, but that we all share this with our neighbors and our communities, and together learn to be bold together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I think that your point about needs and wants is extremely valid, and especially this urgency to address mitigation gap. And the point that you have just raised about systems transformations is really very interesting and intriguing. Food for thought. So thank you very much for the panelists. There are some questions that were raised at the Q&As. Just before we go there, just wanted to thank the panelists for not only your presentations, but for keeping good timing with your presentations. So now we have actually half an hour to go through some of the questions. And there are also some other questions that we thought of asking as well to the panelists to enrich the discussions. So one of them, just before we go to the Q&As, and I know, Robert, you raise your hand, and I will get to you. You will be the first one of the Q&As. So thank you. But one of the questions that I would like to ask to the four panelists, and if you can just maybe keep for like in 2 minutes your answer. That, you know, the sequences of COPs are so important for the direction of the entire planet. If you can share some of the key takeaways of what you consider has worked and failed at COP28. And I know that it is a very difficult question to ask, to be condensed in 2 minutes. Let's put for 3 minutes. But that in the sphere, in the international, national, and local arenas. So if you can, whoever would like to first answer the question.
So shall I go ahead? So I gave a rather longish preamble to the question in the chat, which I won't bother repeating. But basically in 2002, the Bahá'í International Community sort of said to the United Nations that it pointed out the hesitancy to deal properly with religion, to actually deal with religion. and gave reasons for it. I wanted to ask Arthur, has much changed in the past 20 years? With regard to, let's say, intergovernmental panels recognizing the role of religion, or is it just like thrown in a big basket? You know, we've got ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious. Is it part of a basket, or has anything changed in the past 20 years?
Well, let me respond both to Monica's question and to yours. I think with respect to Monica's question, I think what we're seeing, at the COPs and everywhere else in the United Nations in general, is that an intergovernmental system based on national sovereignty, and therefore only voluntary actions, is not sufficient to respond to an issue so driven by science. The planet is not going to wait for the governments to agree to something. We're heading to disaster because the science was saying for 40 years that we've got to act on this, and we're still not acting fast enough. So it's a failure of the whole governance system to respond to the challenges of a civilization and a technology that's been accelerating its damage more and more rapidly and is rapidly raping the whole planet. So I think that's the failure of COP28 is a failure of the whole governance system at present. With respect to Robert's question on the faith, certainly an organization, something like the IPCC, which is very science-based, is not so open to looking at religion in any formal sense. What we are seeing is that often through the indigenous people's perspective and their worldviews, that more management processes are now opening up to consider that values are important and spiritualities are important, not necessarily religion specifically. And there's more so in the Biodiversity Convention than the Climate Change Convention. Biodiversity Convention has actually had major studies of values, has involved indigenous people very explicitly in their worldviews, and that sort of has brought faith in with that as part of the package. So it's happening. I think the other thing that's really the difference is that more and more there are Baha'is who, even if they're not explicitly labeling themselves as Baha'is, are very much involved in these processes and contributing Baha'i perspectives and Baha'i-inspired solutions, whether it be in the Climate Governance Commission, whether it be in the work on the reform of the United Nations, and so on. At a very high level now, Baha'i views are taken into account. Sylvia and I prepared a paper, Climate Governance Commission, a couple of years ago on creating a global environment agency. That was cited by the United Nations High-Level Advisory Panel as a source of recommendations on improving environmental governance. And so it's going forward. So we're having an influence, even if it's not directly labeled as Baha'i. More and more there's a recognition that we have things to contribute and we have solutions to propose. So it's not perfect. There are too many governments who are opposed to religion, or I mean in the case of, for instance, the G20, there's a G20 interfaith forum trying to be involved in the process. But in India, they wanted a Hindu-based approach to religion and not any other religions. And it's sort of been pushed aside for other faith, religious religions. Governments are not open to taking this forward. So we're far from making solution to that problem. A lot more work still needs to be done. Thank you.
No, thank you. No, that's really very good. Very, very interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if the other panelists would like to answer the question.
Monica, if I could go next just quickly, and it's in terms of what worked, was that there was that kind of unity of purpose on the outcome on the global stocktake, and that was not, just let's be very clear here, that was not a given, and so it was it could have been very divisive, but that was avoided. And so given basically, if you look at intergovernmental processes, there are not that many where you have that happening. What has not worked, and that's very important, it's connected to some of the observations, is that countries are still very much looking at their own priorities, and they're not taking global imperatives seriously enough. And so while you can welcome progress at the intergovernmental level, it's far from being enough. So I'm very much agree with Sylvia and others on that front. But when you have an instrument, you need to get as much as possible out of it. And it also comes very much down to accountability. And there has been quite a bit of tendency to make promises, but not deliver on them. And we are seeing some countries actually moving backwards. And for example, just to be very explicit, because United Kingdom was a host of the COP26 and put very much focus on moving away from coal. That same government went back to coal and is now again going back to the fossil era. So this is very disappointing. And another thing that has not been possible to deliver is that kind of building that trust between developed and developing countries. And it's very much connected to the extremes of wealth and poverty on this planet, and that the fact that the impacts of climate change are actually hitting the vulnerable greatest. So we are while I'm painting a positive picture of this outcome, we're very far from where we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Halldór. Rosie and Sylvia, if you would like to add anything. Otherwise, you can pass and then we can go to the other questions.
Yeah, I'll pass since there were other questions for me later.
Yes, it's all right. And Rosie?
Yeah, I'll pass as well. Thank you.
No problem. So then I will actually ask a question to Sylvia and I will ask a question to Rosie then. Just to start with some of the questions. And I think that the first one would be really interesting to hear from Rosie in terms of carbon emissions as a central theme of the discussions. However, peripherically, have you felt that critically important areas such as poverty, biodiversity loss, overconsumption, inequality, and education are areas that have been left aside?
Yeah, in terms of their prominence in the conversation, they aren't given the same importance. And I mean, carbon is our way of measuring, and it's far more quantifiable, especially in a capitalist market economy, to be able to calculate its value, to calculate the output. It's easier to track on an international scale. You can look at the parts per million in the atmosphere, can look at the rising temperatures. It's much easier to track, to collect data on an international scale, but then carbon reductions can be challenging to see where improvements are being made, especially with the carbon credit market, being able to assess the sequestration capacity of different mechanisms. But yeah, it does leave some of these other topics such as poverty, biodiversity loss, overconsumption, education to the wayside, even though these are all pillars to being able to actively tackle the challenge of increasing carbon in the atmosphere, because a lot of it is based off of inequalities within our systems. And so in order to effectively tackle some of these other themes, we have to take an alternative approach. And that's where we can't continue with business as usual in terms of emissions, nor in terms of our economic mindset. And being able to apply circular economy foundations allows space for justice and allows for these topics to be tackled. Because with circular economy, you have the recirculating of resources, you have systems that are built on a more equitable framework, creating greater opportunities, tackling education, because circular economy is not just about like the monetary aspect of economy, it's also about the long-term well-being. So this is one thing that I've been focusing some of my work on, is how to establish circular economy frameworks into some of the systems that we're currently seeing. So I was looking at it in terms of the ocean space, fisheries management. But yeah, it tackles, because climate action without justice is not effective. Because we have to be dismantling some of these systems, some of these economic frameworks that are based off of this concept of infinite growth. Because at the end of the day, like a capitalist market is based on infinite growth and infinite use of resources, which just doesn't work on a finite planet with finite resources. And that's where you wind up with carbon, increasing carbon in the atmosphere, because we're not recirculating these resources. We have challenges around waste management. There's huge amounts of emissions from waste management, from fossil fuel, from producing energy, from non-renewable resources. But then a lot of these are also from frameworks that support inequalities. So we have to tackle both in order to actually affect change. And that's where the values-based approach and entertainment and culture framework also plays a role, because we're trying to make these shifts in terms of humanity's values. So I see it becoming a greater part of the conversation, especially on the grassroots level. But I don't think I see that reflected as much as it needs to be in terms of the policy and the upper level conversations.
Thank you, Rosie. Now, if I can just move to Sylvia and ask, we know that in your view, you have already mentioned that the values-based dimension was not so much considered in the text at COP28, but there were various areas at COP28 that we could really see that there were some relevant organizations and partners that they raised this point about values dimension. And where is that dimension gravitating towards by forming an ongoing narrative? I think it would be really very interesting for us to explore this point and also to understand like where are the most influential spaces that the values-based dimension has been emphasized in the past with the experience that you have had, like if it is related to governance or seeds or technology or financial services and industries, rights of the indigenous population, youth. Where do you see that this is gravitating to?
Well, I wish I knew. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to follow all those other spaces because I was confined primarily to focus on the intergovernmental process. But I would maybe like to first to modify a little bit my statement when I said, if you search for the word values, you cannot find it barely in the text. But there are certain core principles that are very values-based, both in the Paris Agreement, early in the Climate Convention, and the stocktake itself. It's supposed to be based on equity and the best available science. And equity is an extremely powerful word that we can make the center of our conversations in terms of searching for climate justice, and to do so in ways that brings things forward. Because I think sometimes these principles in the political space they're kind of used as what do you call that in English? Battle, like you hitting bats. that they kind of or they hide behind certain of these principles, as a way of protecting themselves from responsibility. But we have so much more access to a deep reflection on what does equity mean, to reflect on that in our individual, community, and a country space. So there are plenty of opportunities to look also at the political agreement from a values lens and to make it our own, and not to let kind of the political tensions decide how those things are interpreted. And maybe I can also take the opportunity I saw that there was one question from Laurent about
yes,
the role of governments. I thought I'll sneak that in because I didn't mean
that's
to
a great
say.
idea. Sylvia, I can also read the question. I can read the
Please
question,
do.
and then
Yeah.
we can. If we cannot count on governments to bring change, then how can we expect the UNFCCC and its various COPs to bring change? Thank you.
Okay, so firstly, I do think we need to very much acknowledge that this process has brought about significant change. That is also one of the conclusions, that when you look at where we would have been without the UNFCCC process and the Paris Agreement, we would have been, I think, closer to 4 or 5 degrees without taking this concerted action together as a world. So we really have to acknowledge that it does have significant impact. It has far from enough impact. And I didn't mean to say that we cannot count on governments alone. On the one hand, we already heard an example from Halldór where governments do not even act up on their own promises. There's a huge lack of accountability there, an inability of others outside to hold the government to account. But in many countries, there are national mechanisms or processes that would have to kick in order to hold governments to account for this. And that all depends on if those societies really care enough about the promises made under these international treaties. But what I wanted to stress was that whatever countries do, it will not be enough without each of us as citizens, as communities contributing as well, because there's no way we can do too much action. Every single thing adds up, and that's why we cannot just leave it to them. We have to take our own responsibilities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I see that a few participants have their hands up. I see Austin, you have your hand up, and you also raised a comment. But is there any specific question that you would like to ask for anyone?
Okay. Hello, everybody. How are you? Okay, I'm in Fiji. So now my big question is, okay, we've obviously learned a lot about COP28 and how it's dysfunctional. We've also been involved in the process for quite some time, some of us here, like Sylvia and Arthur and others. Where do we go from here? I mean, and we have a letter from the House of Justice last November 28th that is encouraging us to really rise up into kind of a leadership role, into a role where we are, I mean, do we have a plan? I mean, I would like to go, I mean, can we reach out to the woman from the Marshalls and the lady from Samoa? Can we identify people that we met, or we see that they have Baha'i virtues, they have a Baha'i outlook on life? Can we recognize, how do we get them on our team? And our team needs to be speaking in the language of the meeting instead of talking about religion. I think we have to speak virtues and values because this is a science-based meeting, and we have to talk about the root cause of the problem being materialism and crass overconsumption and so forth. Can we come up with a statement for the next COP28? And so what I really enjoyed today the most was Arthur's concluding slides and just seriously how discouraged the third world nations are and the indigenous people that went there. So it's almost like 28 is a meeting of the failed and a meeting of the people that are impacted. So the meeting of the impacted people, that's where all the cool stuff is happening. And that's why we need to be there. We need to be there to comfort, to guide, and to kind of direct some things without being politically involved, but kind of bring it to the point of principle, like I was always talking about. So anyway, that's my comment and also my question. Where do we go?
Austin, I think that's a very good point. And maybe I can just add that this is a question also for us to think about if this has proven to be a time, especially with the faith pavilion, right? That has been for the first time added at COP28, that institutions, communities, and individuals are considering this shift of the concept of values-based to spiritual-based principles. And maybe if I can ask Arthur to answer this point, please.
Well, I think one, we're fortunate in the Baha'i faith to have a divinely guided, international, Universal House of Justice, which sets our priorities, which has been saying we should be building the new alternatives. We should be building the new communities from the bottom up. The process of disintegration will continue. We should be working the process of integration, and at some point those two will cross. I think you're in the middle of Fiji, and I think the island countries have been some of those that are most advanced in taking alternative values-based approaches. Look what Vanuatu has been doing, taking the issue to the International Court of Justice. I think they're rejecting GDP as the measure of progress and finding more other ways of measuring progress and well-being in their countries. I think partly because of the work of Baha'i communities in those islands over a long period of time, the values are also spreading more generally into those societies. So I think the more that we can, not necessarily formally bring it into the Sayakal process, but continue to try to have a positive influence on change and evolution where we can make it happen. And the islands are a wonderful place to do that. That will all be part of creating the momentum in a new and better direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. I would like to ask a question to Halldór, and that fits still very well with the previous question, and also with Arthur has just stated. In terms of the climate change tendencies moving, what are some of the key assumptions gathered until COP28 in anticipation of the next 9-year plan and the Paris Agreement, the Paris +10 in Brazil and Paris +20 on the path towards cooperation, mutual assistance, and reciprocity, especially because you were working so closely with the president of COP28, and you have been advising as a senior advisor to the COPs. Would you please give us some guidance of where do you see that this is going to, the tendencies are moving to?
Well, what I think is going to be coming much more stronger through is are the impacts and the suffering, and this is not. And I mentioned, for example, that this fund on loss and damage was a significant win. This is going to take a lot of effort to make this fully impactful. And this is why I'm expecting that the climate process will have to take both adaptation and impacts in a much more focused way, because it really requires international cooperation. There's a lot of the things that you would do to reduce vulnerability that you can never do as a nation state, let alone as this is most evident, of course, with, for example, some of the extreme events and things like that. And this is why I think, yes, it's very important that this process continues to work on the transition, but to be honest, I'm expecting that the transition is going to start happening very fast now, because so much of this is purely economical today. But what I worry about, and this is where I think we should really focus now as an international community, is that the impacts of climate change, they will continue to get worse even when we turn the tide on emissions. And solidarity is something that would drive that, would be the engine of that. And so at the end of the day, this will very much come down to the extent to which we can have that solidarity really manifests itself in some tangible outcomes for the most vulnerable. And this is where I think the imperatives are now. Maybe if I could end by connecting it to Lawrence's question on while we can't trust government, what's the value of an intergovernmental process? I have seen so many times that just bringing the governments together, connecting them to science and connecting them to the realities. I hope the fireworks here in Iceland are not coming through too badly here. When you combine this, governments can be moved. They can do things when you bring them together. And this is why it's absolutely essential that we have the international dimension. But it has to be now, I think, focusing much more on the really difficult years ahead in terms of the impacts of climate change and working to really help the most vulnerable. That would be my appeal. Thank you.
Thank you, Halldór. Paul, you may have a question that you would like to ask. Paul Mentel.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I was wondering about if tree planting was a component of the international conference, if any goals have been set about how many trillion of trees we should be targeting, as a goal, as an international community, because that, as Richard St. Barb Baker, the man of the trees, pointed out many decades ago, that's something that all nations can agree on. Nobody's going to be against tree planting. It can have an enormous impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I see Eva with her hands up, and thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about the participation of the oil and gas corporations in COP and other fossil fuels. Is it feasible to have these banned from participating in COP? Like, they're not countries, so do they need to be there? That's my big question. And also a comment about holding governments to account. I was just reading something about governments promising to do things and then not doing them. And the person that wrote this pointed the finger at influence of corporations, the very rich, and lack of action by the media is how the governments are getting away with this. And I don't know if there's any ways to hold them to account. The only thing I thought of was an ecocide law, and I know there's very smart people working on ecocide laws, but a whole government can't be put in prison, I guess. So anyway, a bunch of questions. I will let people answer.
It's just because we're 1 minute over the time. So if you would like that someone specifically answer. Oh, and I think Sylvia maybe can be answering it.
That was at COP.
Well, I could comment a little bit on just my personal view and personal and practical view on this about banning those with particular interest. On the one hand, they have changed the registration rules for the observers to the COP so that one has to be transparent about which organization one represents. And a few months ago, there was a process very much pushed for by environmental NGOs to try and ban or try and I can't remember now if it was banning, but at least forcing every observer to disclose the kind of fossil fuel investments of their organizations. As member of the steering committee for the Research and Observer Organization constituency, we had serious concerns with this, because in terms of the practical application of such a rule, would be that as a single observer from a university, I would have to figure out what my university invests in fossil fuels, which is hugely, so it would be, the bureaucracy of it would be extremely constricting for many observers. But on a personal point, I think what would happen if you would ban them? They would just meet the governments outside the COP anyway. I think it's pretty transparent and reflecting reality that we have these different interests, and they will be there whether we, and also in states themselves, in governments themselves, they have these interests as well. So I think in one sense, it's an honest display of what the world looks like, that is difficult to come around with. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think that by now, all the hands that were put up, they have been answered. And I think that maybe just to close, if we can have one last question to Arthur. And that was raised by Winona Merritt. And there was another one as well that someone raised on truthfulness having been clearly violated. And in terms of the data indicating that that we're now well past 1.5 degrees Celsius, and this is very alarming. So we really see that before COP28, there were points that have been raised and they were not 100% truthful. So on the values-based and the spiritual-based aspects, Arthur, if you can please answer this question, and then I think we're going to go to close.
I think we have a general problem with our institutions of society today, that most of them are not very trustworthy. Corporations don't have souls. Governments don't have souls. They don't have any kind of a spiritual purpose, and so on and so forth. We've built a society of institutions that do not have any sense of conscience, any sense of having to be truthful, whatever, is the ends of profit or power justify any means. We've institutionalized greed in the corporate structure of the present economy. And therefore, the problem is the values are wrong at the very heart of the system, which makes it so hard, to work for changes, which is why the Baha'i approach really is saying, let's not lose ourselves in the collapsing old world order. Let's put our energies in building a new and better one to take its place. And we're still learning. But there's progress taking place, and I think that's the hope for the future. That at some things may collapse much faster than we expect. Who knows which catastrophe will trigger many others? But it's rebuilding afterwards that needs to be our focus. And I think from that point of view, we can be very hopeful in the medium or long-term future, even if the next few years may be difficult. Thank you.
I wanted to point out right before we close, Austin, who asked the question earlier, was on a team that created a video on coral reefs. The link's over there in the chat. Looks awesome. Just wanted to. And on contribution from one of our members to this panel. And thanks everyone for coming today.